Dan stepped into his new dorm room at Boston University, excitement bubbling just beneath his skin. Freshman year had officially begun, and after saying goodbye to his parents, he felt an overwhelming sense of freedom. As he pushed open the heavy wooden door to the small, musty room, he was greeted by the sight of his roommate, Dale. Dale was already seated at his desk, hunched over his laptop, the glow of the screen reflecting in his wide, unblinking eyes. Dan extended a hand, trying to break the ice. "Hey, I'm Dan." Dale turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly. He reached out with a limp hand, barely making contact before returning to his laptop, mumbling something incoherent. No small talk, no smile, just a cold wall of indifference. Dan felt a chill creeping down his spine, but he dismissed it. People were different after all, and maybe Dale was just shy. As the evening passed, Dale barely left his desk. The clicking of his keyboard was constant, and Dan found it odd that his new roommate never seemed to blink. Ignoring the unease, Dan busied himself with unpacking, trying to focus on the adventure of college life ahead. Exhausted from the day, he soon climbed into bed, pulling the thin blanket over his shoulders. Around midnight, Dan stirred. He wasn't sure what had woken him, but something felt off. His eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the dim glow of the streetlights filtering through the window. As his vision cleared, his heart skipped a beat. Dale was sitting on the edge of his bed, staring directly at him. Dan bolted upright, his voice trembling. "Dale, what are you doing?" Dale didn't move. His expression was blank, eyes wide and unblinking. Then, in a soft, raspy whisper, Dale muttered, "Sorry," before quietly slipping back into his own bed, lying down as if nothing had happened. Dan stayed up for hours, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the image of Dale watching him in the dark. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe his new roommate was a sleepwalker or had some kind of nighttime habit, but there was something unnerving in the way Dale had just sat there, his body rigid, eyes hollow. The next morning, Dan hoped to shake off the unease, hoping it was all just first-day jitters, but Dale's odd behavior continued. During orientation, Dan saw him sitting alone under a tree, rubbing its bark with both hands as if trying to feel something only he could perceive. Other students walked by, whispering and laughing, pointing at Dale's peculiar actions. Dan couldn't help but feel embarrassed for his roommate. By the time evening rolled around, Dan decided he needed to confront Dale about the previous night, but before he could, he noticed something disturbing. Dale was rifling through his backpack. His hands moved swiftly through Dan's personal belongings, his eyes darting toward the door like a guilty child. When Dan confronted him, Dale denied everything, his voice raised, his words frantic and defensive. "I wasn't touching your stuff!" Dale shouted, even as his fingers fidgeted nervously at his sides. His lie was obvious, and his reaction only made things worse. Dan's stomach churned. The guy was definitely off, and the trust between them was already shattered. He began to keep a close eye on his belongings, locking his laptop and stashing his phone in his pillowcase at night. But it wasn't enough. A few nights later, Dan woke again to the sound of something rustling in the dark. His heart pounded in his chest as he slowly sat up. The faint light from the hallway showed Dale, crouched over Dan's duffel bag, his fingers pulling at the zipper. Dan flicked on the lamp, casting a sharp light over the room. "Dale, what the hell are you doing?" Dale froze, his face pale and blank. Then, without missing a beat, he stood up, clutching a toothbrush. "I was just looking for my toothbrush," he said, his voice oddly calm, as though rummaging through someone else's bag in the middle of the night was perfectly normal. That was the breaking point. The next day, Dan requested a room transfer. It didn't take long for housing to approve the switch, and by the following night, he was settled in a new dorm, hoping to leave the unsettling memories of Dale behind. But his peace didn't last long. Around 2 a.m., Dan was startled awake by a strange sound. Someone fiddling with the lock on his new door. His pulse raced as he grabbed his phone, dialing campus security. He held his breath as the sound continued, the door rattling, the lock clicking. Then, silence. When the police arrived moments later, they found Dale, standing outside Dan's door, his face devoid of any expression as he tried to explain himself. His excuse was flimsy, something about wanting to talk things through, but Dan didn't care. He just wanted Dale gone. Dale was arrested that night, and Dan never saw him again. But long after Dale had disappeared, Dan still felt the lingering fear whenever he closed his eyes at night, wondering what might have happened if Dale had managed to get inside. The crisp autumn air had a biting chill that wrapped itself around the trees in the Binghamton University Nature Preserve. A group of friends, Eric, Jenna, and Max, huddled around a crackling fire by the lake, their laughter echoing through the dense woods. It was a Friday night, and they had chosen this remote spot to avoid the watchful eyes of campus police. With their bags filled with cheap beer and snacks, it was supposed to be a fun, carefree night. The preserve, far enough from the campus dorms, offered a perfect escape from the grind of university life. The moon hung low, casting eerie shadows through the skeletal branches overhead. Eric leaned back on a log, taking a swig from his bottle, when the first sound caught his attention, a faint crunch of leaves, distant but distinct. He glanced over at Jenna and Max, who were mid-conversation, and dismissed the noise. Probably a deer or some other wildlife, he thought. It was a nature preserve after all. But the sound came again, this time closer. It was the unmistakable snap of a branch, as though something or someone was moving deliberately. Eric tensed up and nodded toward the woods. "You guys hear that?" he asked, his voice low. Jenna rolled her eyes and laughed. "Relax. It's probably campus security. Hide the beers." Max quickly shoved the cans into a backpack, but something felt off. The sound didn't go away. Instead, it began to circle around their small campsite. Slow, methodical crunches in the dead leaves, moving just out of sight. Eric's skin prickled with unease, his heart racing faster than he cared to admit. He strained his eyes against the dark, but there was nothing there. "Maybe it's just an animal," Max offered, but his voice was tight, betraying his growing fear. The firelight flickered and danced, casting strange shapes into the night, and the circling noise continued, growing bolder, moving closer. At first they tried to laugh it off. "Man, this is like some bad horror movie," Jenna joked, but her laughter was hollow, and her eyes kept darting toward the trees. Eric stood up, his nerves on edge. The once distant noises were now far too close. Then, without warning, a large branch flew into the middle of their fire, sending sparks flying. They all jumped, the adrenaline kicking in. "What the hell?" Max yelled, standing up, his body tense. Jenna clutched her jacket tighter, her eyes wide. The fire crackled as the branch smoldered in the flames, the embers casting a red glow that did nothing to ease their fear. Before they could process what was happening, Max bolted. He didn't say a word, just sprinted into the woods, his footsteps quickly lost in the sound of the forest. "Max!" Jenna screamed after him, but he was gone, swallowed by the darkness. Panic set in for Eric and Jenna, their minds racing. Eric, his heart hammering in his chest, looked frantically into the woods, hoping to see some sign of his friend. But there was nothing, just silence and shadows. Another branch flew from the trees, crashing down inches from where they stood. Jenna shrieked, grabbing Eric's arm. "We have to get out of here," she cried. Eric didn't need convincing. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't playing around. Grabbing their bags, they turned and ran, their feet pounding against the ground as they fled the woods. Every step felt like it took them deeper into the nightmare. They could hear the rustling of leaves behind them, something chasing, something just out of view. Eric dared not look back. They ran faster, breathless, their legs burning as they sprinted toward the campus, the distant glow of the dorms a faint promise of safety. They didn't stop until they reached the edge of the woods, gasping for air, their lungs burning. Jenna doubled over, hands on her knees, her body shaking. Eric glanced back one last time and froze. There, at the edge of the tree line, was a figure. It stood still, almost blending into the shadows, but Eric could see it pacing, back and forth, watching them. His stomach dropped, and for a moment he couldn't move. He wanted to call out, but his throat was dry, his voice lost. The figure turned and slowly disappeared back into the forest. The two stumbled back to their dorm, slamming the door behind them. They locked it, the tension in the air heavy as they sat in silence, hearts still racing. They didn't speak much that night, not about what they saw or what they heard, but the figure remained etched in their minds, a lingering shadow they couldn't shake. The next morning, over breakfast, they tried to laugh it off. "Just some idiot messing with us," Eric muttered, though the uncertainty in his voice was palpable. Jenna forced a smile, but kept glancing nervously toward the window. None of them saw Max for the rest of the weekend. They pretended everything was fine, but deep down, they knew they weren't alone in those woods that night. and whatever had stalked them from the darkness was still out there, waiting. The night air was sharp and cold, the kind of autumn evening where the wind cuts through even the thickest jackets. Kyle and his roommate, Ben, stood outside the dilapidated two-story house, glancing at each other with mild apprehension. The house belonged to Theta Kappa Psi, a low-ranking frat known more for its off-campus location in Eugene's rougher neighborhood than for its brotherhood. But it was a Friday night, and after weeks of midterms, they were eager to blow off steam. The party was already in full swing when they walked in, the thick scent of beer, sweat, and cheap cologne filling the air. The lighting was dim, with only a few flickering bulbs casting uneven shadows across the room. The place was packed, mostly with guys, and the few girls who were there looked as uncomfortable as Kyle felt. Music thudded loudly, the bass vibrating the floorboards beneath their feet. Kyle could sense something was off immediately, but leaving now, after barely showing up, would have seemed awkward. Besides, they had walked all the way from campus to this godforsaken house. It felt like they owed it to themselves to stick around, even if just for a bit. They made their way to the back of the house, squeezing past sweaty bodies and dodging a couple of guys roughhousing near the makeshift bar set up in the kitchen. Ben leaned over, yelling into Kyle's ear over the music. "This place sucks! We should bail!" Kyle nodded but didn't move, unsure if Ben was serious. Before either could act, a heavyset guy with a backward baseball cap and a glazed-over expression stumbled toward them. "Yo, you look like you need something to loosen up," he slurred, pushing a small dark bottle into Kyle's hand. "Just take a sip. Trust me." Kyle looked down at the bottle. It wasn't labeled, just a clear liquid sloshing inside. Ben raised an eyebrow but didn't object when Kyle shrugged and took a small sip, the liquid tasting like strong alcohol with a bitter aftertaste. The guy clapped Kyle on the back and walked off, leaving them standing there, unsure of what had just happened. Minutes passed, and Kyle began to feel strange. His head grew heavy, and the edges of his vision started to blur. The room swayed as if the floor beneath him had turned to jelly. "Ben," Kyle tried to say, but his words came out sluggish, his tongue thick and uncooperative. His legs wobbled, and he grabbed onto the counter for support. "Something's wrong," he managed, but the words felt like they were coming from someone else, distant and distorted. Ben's face twisted in concern, but his voice was muffled, drowned out by the pulsing music and the growing haze in Kyle's mind. The world around him began to spin, faster and faster until everything went black. Kyle awoke groggily, his head pounding like he'd been hit by a truck. It was dark, so dark that at first he wasn't even sure if his eyes were open. Faint, muffled music filtered through the walls, reminding him where he was, or at least where he had been. He sat up slowly, the room spinning as he tried to get his bearings. He was in a bedroom, though the details were fuzzy. The bed beneath him creaked as he shifted, his body heavy and unresponsive. Panic began to creep in, cold and sharp, much like the air outside. As he tried to stand, his foot hit something on the floor, a crinkling sound like a plastic bag. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound came again, this time from the closet. Something, or someone, was in there, moving. His mind raced, horror clawing at his insides as he imagined what could be waiting behind the thin closet door. Adrenaline surged through him, pushing him to his feet despite the dizziness. He staggered toward the door, his body screaming at him to run. Flinging the bedroom door open, Kyle bolted down the narrow hallway. The party was still raging below, the sounds of laughter and drunken shouts an eerie contrast to the terror gnawing at him. He had to find Ben, had to get out. Downstairs, Kyle spotted Ben near the front door, looking equally uneasy. "We need to leave. Now," Kyle rasped, grabbing Ben's arm. Without hesitation, they pushed their way through the crowd and out into the cold night air. They hurried back toward campus, the silence between them filled with unspoken fear. Kyle's heart was still racing, the lingering effects of the drug making his thoughts foggy. But as they walked, he realized he'd escaped. His clothes were still intact, and though his body felt violated by the drug's effects, there was no physical pain. He hadn't been assaulted, at least not in the way he feared, but the thought of what could have happened left him shaken to his core. Back in the safety of their dorm, Kyle sat on the edge of his bed, his hands trembling. He would never know what had been waiting in that closet or what the intentions of the stranger with the bottle had been. But one thing was certain: he was never going back to a frat party again. Matt Henderson sat at his desk, hunched over his textbooks. His sophomore year at Syracuse University had been a whirlwind so far. Endless assignments, study sessions, and sleepless nights. He'd been fortunate enough to secure a single dorm room, tucked away in a secluded corner of the 4th floor of Brewster Hall. The isolation at first felt like a blessing. No noisy roommates or loud parties next door. But lately, as fall crept in with its cold winds and lengthening nights, the solitude was beginning to get to him. The silence felt heavier somehow, like the walls were pressing in. It was a quiet night, just before midnight, and Matt was finishing a reading assignment for his history class when he heard it, a faint tapping at the door. Tap, tap, tap. He frowned, pushing his textbook aside. It was too late for visitors, and no one on his floor ever really bothered him. "Hello?" he called out, his voice uncertain. No response. He hesitated for a moment, then got up and opened the door. The hallway was empty. A dim light flickered at the far end near the stairwell, casting eerie shadows along the corridor. Matt leaned out, looking both ways. Nothing. He let out a nervous chuckle, shaking his head. Probably someone playing a prank, he thought. He closed the door and returned to his desk. The following night, the knocking came again. Only this time, it was louder. Thud, thud, thud. Matt froze, his pencil hanging mid-air over his notebook. The sound was distinct, rhythmic, and unsettling. His heart thudded in his chest. He stood up quickly, walking to the door with more confidence than he felt. He yanked it open. Again, no one. The hallway stretched out before him, empty and silent. A chill ran down his spine, and he closed the door slowly, trying to shake the creeping sense of unease. It was just some bored kid trying to get a rise out of him. Nothing more. But the third night was different. He was barely able to focus on his work, his mind fixated on the knocking that he was almost certain would come. When it finally did, it wasn't a knock. It was a pounding. Thump, 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 like someone banging their fist against the wood. Matt shot up, adrenaline surging through him. He pulled open the door, and for the first time, he saw someone. A figure disappeared around the corner at the end of the hallway, their silhouette fleeting in the dim light. Without thinking, Matt bolted after them. His bare feet slapped against the cold tile as he chased the shadow down the hall. Whoever it was, they were fast. He skidded around the corner just in time to see the door to the communal bathroom swing shut. Matt approached cautiously, heart racing. He could hear his own breath, ragged and shallow. He pushed open the bathroom door, stepping inside. The air was stale and damp, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above him. He scanned the room, nothing. Then beneath the stall doors, he saw them. A pair of black boots, just visible under the farthest stall. "Hey!" Matt shouted, his voice echoing off the tiled walls. No response. With trembling hands, he slowly pushed open the door to the stall. His blood ran cold. The boots were there, neatly positioned on the floor, but no one was inside them. He stared at the empty boots for a moment, his mind racing to make sense of it. Then from behind him, a sound sliced through the silence. Laughter. Not the light-hearted laugh of a prankster, but the low, rasping cackle of an old man, twisted and insane. The sound crawled under Matt's skin, making his blood turn to ice. He whipped around, but there was no one there. Panicking, he bolted out of the bathroom, sprinting back down the hall and into his room. He slammed the door shut, locking it with shaking hands. His chest heaved as he pressed his back against the door, listening. And then, as if mocking him, the knocking returned, soft at first, then growing louder and louder, until it felt like the door would break under the pressure. Matt squeezed his eyes shut, refusing to open it this time. After what felt like an eternity, the knocking finally stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. The next morning, Matt questioned everyone on his floor, but no one admitted to knowing anything about the knocking, the figure, or the boots. His dormmates laughed it off, chalking it up to stress, maybe even a dream. But Matt couldn't shake the feeling that something far more sinister was at play. Who was behind the door? And worse, what? As the weeks passed, the knocking never returned, but the memory lingered, gnawing at the edges of Matt's sanity. The thought of that eerie laughter, the boots with no owner, and the figure vanishing into thin air haunted him. Brewster Hall remained a place of study and sleep for most, but for Matt, it had become a prison, a place where he was never truly alone.